Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Senator Bernie Sanders and President Donald Trump. Many of us may be hard-pressed to see what those two have in common. But according to a recent opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, among other prominent elected officials, commentators, public intellectuals, and business leaders, both Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and the like have all voiced concern about the death of the American dream. Now, this is something that Lance and I have talked about a few times before, so you might wonder, well, why are we talking about this again? Well, this opinion piece is titled "The American Dream is Alive and Well." And of course, it's linked at thestateofus.org, so you can take a look. In line with what we try to do here on The State of Us, which is look at that other side, we wanted to take this on today and kind of break down the argument being made and see what we agree with versus what we refute. And kind of walk you through it here to see maybe Lance and I weren't quite as right about the American dream being gone as we thought we were. So we're going to find out. And of course, I think you care because the American dream is something that affects any of us living in America, that upward mobility, wages, those speak to the fabric of American society. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the American dream, history, the economy, and more without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I just totally believe in this, and I listened to you over the last few years and done all this reading, and you younger folks have changed my mind slightly on this, but and I see some of the points that are being made that it's not the same as when I was back in my 20s and 30s. And I agree with that, but it's an interesting debate to have and see where we're going to go, particularly here in the middle of the season when we are looking to elect a president. So let's see where we're going to go with this.
So basically, Lance, the article, the author makes several points. And by the way, it should be noted that this piece, when you read it, you'll find out the gentleman who wrote it, this is actually an excerpt from his new book that's coming out called "The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It." So if you want more in depth than what we do today, you could always check that out. But basically, he lays out 5 key areas that he attempts to refute as we go through this. The first is the game is rigged, we often hear, for everyone except those at the top. And wages and income have been stagnant for decades. So we're going to start by taking on those two. In the next segment, we'll talk about some of the others. But let's look at those. He starts out by explaining, have wages stagnated for decades? No. Since the summer of 1990, a peak in the business cycle, their wages have increased by 33% after accounting for inflation. This is referring to the middle class. Mm-hmm. This is a considerable increase in purchasing power of typical households. True, it is less than the increase enjoyed by the top 1%, and Americans should not be satisfied with the pace of increase. Policies should do more to help ensure that workers can command higher wages in the labor market, but wages have not stagnated for decades. The narrative of stagnation is persistent in part because for a considerable time it was true. And this is your history component here, Lance.
Exactly.
He explains that post-World War II labor market, right, was broken up into multiple periods, but from the late 1940s into the mid-1970s, inflation-adjusted wages experienced rapid growth, much more so than the rest of our history. Then followed 2 decades of stagnant and even declining wage growth. Since the mid-1990s, wages have largely been increasing for typical workers, even if more slowly than in the 1960s.
Which is the interesting part because, and I know that I'm in a different spot because I was in public education and things grew very rapidly during that time. But I am earned almost, the majority of my money during the time when he's pointing out that it was 2 decades of stagnation, even decline in wage growth, because I entered the workforce as a full-time worker without going to school in 1984. Now, I was a full-time worker in 82 and 83 and decided that I wasn't going to go anywhere, which would have been during that time of stagnation, and went back to school and then finished my degree and came out as a teacher in 84 and 85. And it's amazing to me what I've been able to accomplish then. So it's the point being that things were really, really good. I mean, for a lot of the baby boomer generation, 40s to the 70s, the folks that are a little bit older than me. But then with me, he's pointing out that it was stagnant and then has grown since the mid 1990s. And that's, you can't fault the numbers. Now, his point is well taken. And that is, if it's grown by 33% since 1990, that's a little over 1% a year.
Right.
So it's not a huge wage growth, and it's not anything near what most people argue, you know, the top 1%, those people that want to do away with capitalism or think it's not working very well, point out that, well, the top 1% is doing a lot better than that. But at the same time, it's not, you cannot argue that they have not grown.
Right.
They maybe haven't grown as quickly as you feel they should be or as quickly as needs be, but you can't say that they haven't grown because he points out, yes, they have.
Well, and he goes on to talk about, because this is one I think that we hear a lot, especially from those on the left and particularly the far left, is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? This is one of those commonly pushed notions. And I think that's the game is rigged for everyone except those at the top. So here's what he says about that. Using a standard measure of income inequality, that the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, finds that the rich-poor gap in market income grew by only 2% between 2007, when concern about inequality increased at the start of the Great Recession, and 2016. So from 2007 to 2016, Lance, market income grew only 2%, that rich-poor gap. When measuring income after taxes and transfers, the CBO finds that inequality actually decreased by 7%. So if you look at just the raw numbers, the rich-poor gap grew by 2%. But if we take into account taxes and transfers, then the income inequality actually decreased by 7 percentage points during that same time period.
Exactly.
And that's something, sometimes I hear stats like this, Lance, and I wonder, it's like, where is the news media when people make these claims, you know, about things like the rich-poor gap? This is the Congressional Budget Office. It's not like this is some obscure source that nobody's ever, you know, looked into this before. And what it basically tells us is that because here's the thing. This isn't saying that the rich-poor gap is tiny. Okay.
Right.
Because it's not. It's a big, I mean, we've talked before about, you know, the money that the 1% has versus the money that the bottom 90% has. There is a big difference in that.
But again, that's where you go. Again, you know, the numbers are the same, and we're both sides, and then wherever we are looking at the same set of numbers, but it's what you want to extrapolate from those numbers to make your point is what you can do. And that therein lies the problem, is that we both look at the same set of numbers, and they're going after on the left saying, look at, you know, the rich are getting richer, and they're saying the poor are getting poor. But what they're saying is the poor is not getting as rich as the wealthiest. And that's true.
Right.
You can't argue that. But at the same time, what they're missing and what they're not pointing out is that the poor, or the lowest level, not really the poor, but the lowest level, are better off than they used to be. Their standard of living is higher. Right. Their wages are higher.
It has gone up.
And it's not just wages, as they point out. It's also your health insurance. There are other things, you know, how much of your retirement does your company pay into for you? Those are all parts of, you know, we used to call those things, you know, in the old days, you know, what are the kind of the extras that you get? You know, just don't look at the salary. What's your insurance? What's your, you know, what else do you get besides, you know, what are some of the perks within the job, not just the salary? And so many times we just look at the salary. So it's an interesting scenario, but I think we all look at the same numbers and we pick out what we want to talk about, and then we don't get the truth.
I want to clarify when Lance and I say we, right, all look at the same numbers, I think you're referring to you, me, and this guy who's writing this article, because one of the problems is that some of these people, far left or far right, are not, right? They refute some of these numbers, or they won't acknowledge them. They'll act like they don't exist. And I think that's a big part of the problem. They'll say, well, here's this problem with that number and this problem with that number. And that some of that might be true, right? I mean, there might be some inconsistencies in the numbers, but at the same time, they're not big enough to be notable. And I think the rich-poor gap thing in particular, the story to take away there is that these leaps are being made, especially by people on the left and the right who are saying the dream is dead. When they say, that rich people are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer, that's not true. I mean, the data tells us right here that everybody's getting more money. And in fact, the income gap, they make it out to be this huge thing, is only 2% from 2007 to 2016, which isn't that crazy, a 2% growth.
But like you have pointed out repeatedly to me, and I am now a believer in, is that when I was working for minimum wage, it was worth a lot more. It was more valuable than minimum wage is today.
Right.
And I was
your buying power.
I was discussing with someone who wasn't, they weren't a Bernie supporter, but they wanted Elizabeth Warren, but they did believe in the free, or in the forgiveness, the college forgiveness.
Oh.
And my answer to them was, well, nobody made you take that money, but I will say this, that if we would raise the minimum wage, that would give you more money to pay off your debt. Mm-hmm. Now, see, I'm not against that, because the numbers, and you in particular pointing that out to me, has made it clear to me in the last 2 to 4 years that what I was making minimum wage had a lot more buying power than what minimum wage does now. So to me, the way to keep the American dream alive and to solve this problem is to raise the minimum wage, which then will make things cost more. I understand that, but I think it should a little bit. There needs to be a little bit of inflation, because my money's buying a whole lot of stuff that maybe isn't necessarily good for me to buy. And I'll talk about that later. But the point is, you raise minimum wage, then it makes it easier for these people to pay back their loans and to keep the dream, the American dream, alive.
So we've talked about the first two claims so far that the author of this piece from the Wall Street Journal claims, which is the game is rigged. We often hear for everyone except those at the top, and wages and incomes have been stagnant for decades, we are told. So he refutes a couple of those points. We've broken them down, discussed a little bit about that. Coming up in the next segment, we'll look at how this author refutes the middle class has been permanently weakened and America is no longer an upwardly mobile society. Are those true? Is there any evidence to support his refute of those 2 points? Keep it here on The State of Us to find out, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Is the American dream alive and well? It's a topic Lance and I have discussed on numerous occasions, and today we're getting to go over a piece from the Wall Street Journal entitled "The American Dream is Alive and Well." If you want to read the piece for yourself, you can do so. Go to thestateofus.org. We've got the article linked there for your reference as always. So far, we've looked at the game is rigged for everyone except those at the top. Wages and incomes have been stagnant for decades. Those are 2 points that the author of this actually refutes in his piece. And he goes on to say some of the others that he refutes: the middle class have been permanently weakened and America is no longer an upwardly mobile society. And those are the 2 that we're going to look at now. So he goes on, Lance, to explain here that, of course, the middle of the labor market has not been deliberately hollowed out in the sense that populists on the left and right assert by free trade supporting quote-unquote elites. That's a term we hear a lot. Mm-hmm. Looking to enrich themselves at the expense of the working class. But hollowing out is a real phenomenon, and it has caused significant disruption. Research by MIT economist David Otter finds that in 1970, total employment was split evenly among low, middle, and high-wage occupations, 31, 38, and 30% respectively. Today, though, unemployment in the middle wage, middle skill occupations has fallen to just 23%. So the bold claim, and this is again, I think that building thing, Lance, that we talk about, right? If this, then that.
Right.
And those are some of the steps that can be dangerous, because saying that, you know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and that's because the middle class has been hollowed out, isn't necessarily true. And in fact, part of what he goes on to explain is that data from the U.S. Census Bureau from 1967 through 2018 shows a 12-point drop in the share of households with inflation-adjusted income between $35,000 and $100,000. So the quote-unquote middle class, right, seems to be disappearing. But here's where the rest of the story comes in that you don't get told. The share of low-income households, those earning less than $35,000, also fell over the same period. So those middle-class people didn't go to the low-income bracket.
No.
And in fact, the share of households earning over $100,000 has tripled,
Right.
rising from 10% to 30%. And that's from 1967 through 2018. So, you know, I mean, part of the story there is some of the quote unquote middle class has disappeared, or maybe we're not defining the middle class correctly anymore.
Well, and part of this, and I'm going to bring this up, and it is not talked about in the article anywhere, but part of that is a saying, and you have to be careful, says household income. And if you have a significant other who's also working, you know, then that's household income. So it's two of you. And I think where many of the young people that I talk to are still are out there on their own, because we do also know that demographically people are putting off marriage and living together and relationships longer and longer as they are struggling to make ends meet, as they are trying to pay off school, things like that. So you have to be careful, because when you say household income, now you're putting, and you have two-wage earners in the home to get you to that threshold of over $100,000.
Because 100,000 sounds like a lot, but that
Right.
you could be two people making 55,000.
Right. Exactly. And whereas when you go back all the way back to the 60s, you're just seeing women enter the workforce. It was still, we were at the tail end of men being the main breadwinners. And if women were working, they were working part-time, or they were only working until they got married, and then they were still housewives. And that whole dynamic has changed. And as that dynamic changes, now then there are two people out earning full-time money. So obviously they're going to make more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have more to spend, because the studies have also been done that when the second person goes out to work, there are a lot of costs involved in that, you know, for childcare, extra transportation, food, clothing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you have to be careful. It's not all pure profit when the second person goes out to work. Be it, and notice I'm saying people, I'm not using any he, she, you know, I don't care who it is, but that second person goes out to work, then there's some costs that cut into the amount of money that they are making.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, the changing nature of relationships, the household. Part of the problem when you're looking at, is the American dream, you know, still achievable, or is it still real, is that, and this guy actually acknowledges it, is that it's different for each generation, right?
Right.
And that's part of the problem, I think, when we look at it, is it's so easy to say that it's gone because, and this is what I've said before. So just to be clear, because people are like, well, you know, have you guys totally changed your minds? No, what I said is that the dream, and this is what Lance talked about before, right? The dream that he was sold and that my parents were sold, that's what I'm saying's not around anymore. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, because it changes for each generation. That idea of, you know, you're going to go to work here. You don't necessarily have to have a college degree, right? And if you work hard, you'll be able to buy a house, put some cars in the driveway, fill it with kids, own some appliances, live in the suburbs. It'll be a nice life.
Right.
That's not the same narrative, but part of the reason it's not is because that's not necessarily what millennials or Gen X want.
They don't want to do that.
Right.
They don't want to live out in the suburbs. They want to live in the city. They want to live where the action is. And And also technology changes things, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
I mean, the opportunities are there to do different things. You don't have to do that. And I pointed to, I'm reading the article.
He talks about the new middle, right?
Right. Well, and he's talking about how, well, we've lost jobs because robots are doing it. But it's ironic. I was talking to a former student who is late 30s, early 40s. And he works at a local company here where his job is to fix the robots and to run the robots. And he said, Mr. Jackson, you know what my biggest problem is as the manager of this area of the company? I can't find people who want to come and work. I'm paying them $18 to $20 an hour. They have to have no technical background. I will train them. It's basically video game type controlling of these robots and fixing them. I will train them, and I can't find people who will come to work on time 5 days a week so that we can keep everything running. He said, and I'm hearing how rough the economy is. And he said, I'm willing to pay them $18 to $20 an hour with no education. All they have to do is come to work 5 days a week and be willing to work an 8-hour shift.
Yeah.
And it's when I hear things like that from people, former students that I have who are out in the workplace, then it makes me like, okay, is it the American dream or what's happened here? And I'm not saying $20 an hour makes you, because I can do the math and figure out how much that is annually, that you're going to live high on the hog off of that. But that's significantly more than what everybody's saying we need to raise the minimum wage
right
to $15 an hour. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's, and they can't find people to work, and people are complaining.
Well, and here goes
about the economy, and you can't find people to work at $20 an hour. And then there's another company that I know of, a former student is running. They offered to pay me $18 an hour, and all I'm going to do is watch pills go down the line to fill the bottles.
Right.
And then all I have to do is run I can either seal the bottles, and can keep the machine running, or I can run a forklift and just take the loaded boxes of pills and go store them in the warehouse. Either way, I'm making $18 an hour. And the thing is, they need to produce more. They can't run all their lines because they don't have enough workers.
Mm-hmm.
They want to run full lines, three shifts, and they're running at about 60% capacity because they can't find enough workers, and they're paying $16 to $18 an hour.
Well, and here's the other thing with this new middle, right? He talks about, and that's kind of what Lance is discussing, is the jobs have changed, because one of the other common things that's brought up, right, is look at all these jobs that have gone away. What
exactly
this particularly was, we've talked about some of Bernie Sanders' talking points, and a lot of these were shared by Bernie and Trump. But one that I think was more uniquely Trump, right, was this message of your old industry jobs went away, and so now there's no jobs, and I'm going to bring those jobs back.
Right.
When we talked, I think the thing that we talked about before was Bernie and his billionaires, and how that gap just is huge, and it just keeps growing exponentially, and it's a 2% gap from 2007 to 2016. So that was a Bernie point more specifically. A Trump point more specifically is this idea that that the jobs are just gone. The old industry jobs are, but they've mostly been replaced with new industry jobs. And that's part of why unemployment is so low, is because the jobs aren't gone. The jobs changed. They were replaced by new jobs, I guess is the way to put it. Those old jobs are gone, but there's new jobs in their place.
Well, I remember President Clinton way back in the 90s talking about how we're going to have to retrain the American worker. It's not that we're not going to have jobs for them to do, but you can't do the same job you've been doing for the last 20 years. Let's say you started working when you were 18 and you're going to retire with Social Security at 65. You have 47 years of work there, So, okay, you've been doing this job for 20 years or 25 years. Okay, there's still a job for you, but we're going to have to retrain you because the job is going to be different for the last half of your career. Okay, that doesn't mean there aren't any jobs, and that doesn't mean that they're not decent paying jobs.
Right. Well, and part of what we're actually going to look at next, Lance, because this is so far a lot of what he said, or a lot of the way he's refuted these things, I don't think I've openly disagreed with before, because I pretty much agree with the summation that he's arriving at as a result of here's what the data says, and here's what some of the pundits, right, or some of the politicians are saying, and here's why those bold and sweeping statements aren't right. But part of what we're going to look at next is, I think, what this all comes down to, right, which is the notion that is capitalism broken, right? And that's a talking point that a lot of people are keen to pay attention to right now, whether or not they agree with it, but a lot of people believe that that's the case. That's what we're going to look at next. Before we do, Lance, though, it's important that we take a second, right, and tell people, what are we trying to do here today on The State of Us? We're part of a network called True Chat, all these different programs, and we've got a common goal that all these shows pursue. What is that?
True Chat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
Hopefully we're getting that done, and if you guys want to follow along, as always, you can go to thestateofus.org. We've got a lot more to come. We're going to talk about, is capitalism broken? That's what it all kind of boils down to. That's the question that we have to answer. To find out whether or not capitalism is broken, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Is capitalism broken? That's what our show today comes down to, the ultimate question. We've looked at an opinion piece from the Wall Street Journal entitled, "The American Dream is Alive and Well," which I think to some of our listeners may sound counter to what Lance and I have claimed before. But I want to be clear, because I mentioned this earlier in the episode. I think a lot of what Lance and I have talked about is that it's not the same, that it's different, and that there was a very specific idea, right, of what the American dream was when it was created. What this gentleman's talking about in his piece is the idea that you can move up in society, that if you work hard, you can get ahead, that if you want a job, you can find one. I think that more general, broad-based American dream or ideal maybe
is what he's talking about,
is what he's after.
Not compared to what?
Compared to you can find a job, you can buy a house, you can have kids, you can own some cars.
Gotcha.
You can fill your house with stuff. And not that that's, I don't mean to sound condescending like that's a bad dream, right? It's a more specific version
but
of that.
Do you think with what's going on today economically that you can get that second dream? I think what we've been arguing is maybe you can't.
Right. I don't think, because here's the deal.
Or is it a dream that people don't want anymore?
I think it's
or is the frustration that people can't get that dream and that's the one they want? I mean, where are we here? Okay.
I think you asked me 4 questions.
I did.
I don't know.
Well, that's what happens when it goes to open mic time in the third segment.
I know.
You run the first 2, the third one, I get to come.
I got all these questions.
I've got questions for you. Because I think you're right. He's talking about a different American dream.
Yeah.
And then there's the American dream that I had that, you're going to, cohabitate with somebody and you're going to raise a family and you're going to have a nice home and you're going to have a new car in the driveway and you're going to have your stuff.
Right.
Okay. So now that's maybe not what he's talking about, but what is it that our Bernie supporters out there, okay, and our Trump supporters who say that doesn't exist anymore, and the Bernie supporters who say it's never going to exist, so we have to go to a different route.
Right.
Is that what people are wanting? Are they wanting more than, and I'm not trying to speculate here. I'm not trying to get us off into that tangent, but if it's because, $20 an hour, I figured it up, basically is about $42,000 a year. And then you throw in your health insurance package and whatever else you have. Let's say roughly you get to $50,000 a year. And that's not enough. You're not going to buy a house and live happily ever after if you're single, but you get to the $100,000 household thing,
right,
by doing, $20 an hour. Is that what the younger people want? Is that what they're saying when they look at me and say, we can't get what you got and that's what we want? Or are they wanting something else? And what he's talking about is the American dream still isn't going to supply what their dream is.
My take on it is that there's 2 primary things happening here. There's the kind of refute of older generations. And I think this is just a historical thing. I mean, right now it's baby boomers, talking about millennials, but that'll change. Someday it'll be millennials talking about, the younger, their kids. Oh,
you read your Roman history book. You know that this is just an ongoing battle.
It's a cyclical thing.
It always goes on. Sure.
But I guess my point in that is just saying that kind of what the message is right now, right, is that, if millennials just would work hard, they could have what I have. If they were just not as lazy, their technology's ruined everything. Some of these, I think, very general things that get perpetrated, the millennial refute to that, right, is two things. One, we can't have that because it's not still achievable. And even if we could have it, we don't want it.
Right.
So maybe that answers it's a twofold thing.
It does, because you've proven to me that while I had some of those ideas, I don't believe that anymore. But my question then becomes, what is it they want? Because I have a real hard time, like I said, with this forgiveness of loans and free college.
Yes.
Because I have problems with those ideas, because I do think you have to work for things. Mm-hmm. Don't give me somebody who's going to say you don't owe that money, because you do owe that money. And you did decide to take it. And if you made a bad decision, well, that's on you. You need to pay it back. But I said, what if we decided to get wages up to where they probably should be if we adjust everything for inflation, and you had more money every month? He goes, oh, well, then I'm fine. I'll pay back my loans. And so I know you find this hard to believe, but I was able to sit down with a young person, and they came from one area and I came from the other. And the two of us came to an agreement on how we could solve the problem for both of us. Mm-hmm. Me wanting to make sure that people pay back money that they borrow, and him saying, I can contribute more to society if I didn't have these loans holding me down. We said, hey, we'll raise wages and we both get what we want.
I think that part of the problem is,
should I be running for president now instead of the people that are? Well, did I just solve the problem for everybody there? Or am I way too,
the state of
optimistic?
The state of us has solved, how many problems over the years, Lance?
We have
pretty much all of them.
Yeah.
At one point or another, we can usually figure out, here's something that we think that most people could be okay with, maybe it's not exactly what they want. And I think that's another side of this.
Exactly. I didn't say that I was totally happy with it.
Right.
Nor was he.
It was a compromise.
But we could both live with it, and both thought that would improve the situation and make both of us happy. We can both live with it.
And I think that's part of what this all boils down to. The message that capitalism is broken, I honestly believe, because that was kind of what we started the segment with. I think if you listen to everything we said, I don't think it's broken. I think it's doing exactly what it's meant to do. The problem is that we don't understand. And when I say we, I mean as a society, we're not well versed in how to make capitalism work for us. And what I mean by that is, I think it's this idea that, we've talked a lot about college tuition, because that's one of those big sticking points. And you asked, what do millennials want?
Well, it's one of the big issues for millennials, because they are the ones who have the college debt.
One of your tenets of a free market or capitalistic society, right, is this law of supply and demand. And you and I have talked some about that with college. And part of the reason, right, the reason that we're in the situation, why is it so expensive, and why? It's because we have more people going, which is counterintuitive, because typically we think about if more people want something, it gets cheaper.
Right.
The reason it's more expensive right now, Lance, is because there's a limited number of institutions that offer it. So it's harder, right, to find somebody who offers the service, and they're not keeping up with the requests that they have coming in. The other side of this is that because more people are going to college, right, it makes the fact that you've gone to college not as unique. Mm-hmm. You're getting qualified for higher paying jobs, but you don't stand out as much as you used to stand out. And those are all very basic components.
There's more competition for those high paying jobs.
Right. It's a twofold problem, but capitalism isn't doing anything wrong. It's working exactly the way that it works. The problem is that we're not working within that system to solve it. We're doing things like saying, well, we'll just give everybody, free college and that'll fix it. And it doesn't solve one of the two problems. I think the big thing for millennials is honestly, it's the choice of what to do. We were sold by many of our parents that the key was to go to college.
That's exactly the words he used.
And the disenfranchisement that's occurring is the result of we went to college, but now we can't make it. The boomer dream, right, and their parents' dream was a lot more specific in terms of end goal. I think the millennial dream was sold to them as you go to college and you can do what you want.
But you can't make enough money and still have the free time to go do all the things that you want to do and save the planet and save the whales and do all the things that are, very worthwhile. I'm not making fun of it or being sarcastic that way, but you can't do those things and then make enough money to have all the things that the older generation had.
Right. So I guess
is that fair? Is that kind of what you're saying there?
I think it's the detachment between, in today's society, more so than ever before, the notion of the importance of the college degree has become so prevalent that you feel that you have to get it, and then you get it, and then you don't feel like it really did as much as it used to do for you, which I think is just true. But that's because we haven't adapted to a world where more people go to college, and understanding how that system works, So I think it all comes down to, when you ask, is the American dream alive and well? I think that the problem that comes into play, and the reason that we've argued that not so much, is it's very relevant. It's very relevant to what is your American dream. And that's part of the detachment, I think, between millennials and boomers right now, is that their ideas of what that is are different.
So we need to define it, and then we can maybe come to some kind of agreement on how to accomplish it.
Right. I mean, that's how you and I start most conversations about solve a problem. Let's make sure we know what the problem is. Let's make sure that we agree that it's a problem, and then we can talk about how to fix it. And the problem here is we haven't agreed what the problem is, I think.
Two different thoughts in the minds. And so therefore we'll never solve it because we're both thinking of two different items as we're having our discussion.
Right. And that's a breakdown of, like so many things, Lance, a breakdown of communication. Yep. So I think a lot of what he says in the article, for the most part, I probably agree with about 70 to 80% of it. I think there's some things that, we're not looking at the full picture, but you all read the article for yourselves and see what you think. Thestateofus.org has it linked.
And let us know, right? Let us know what your thoughts are here. And if we're way off base, or if you kind of agree with some of what we're saying.
Yeah, please do, because that's part of how we make all this work. And speaking of make this work, Lance, it's important that other people, right? If you're an avid listener, you've been out there listening a while, this is released as a podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's also a syndicated radio program. So there's a lot of different ways to listen. But if you want to listen to it as a podcast or invite other people to tune into it as a podcast, what are some of the ways that our people out there could do that, Lance?
Well, first of all, please invite other people to listen, because we think we're if you're listening to us and you like us, and then you agree that we've got something to say that's of the utmost importance for people to hear. So we need more people to listen, but hey, you can get there with Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. Thestateofus.org.